Mike Johnson, a small-town mechanic, had pulled an all-nighter installing specialized hand controls for a veteran, Frank Miller, refusing payment from a man who clearly couldn't afford it. The next morning, the ground-shaking roar of a P-51 Mustang fighter plane ripped through the sky. What happened next would change both men's lives forever. Hey everyone, welcome to Tales Unveiled. Let's dive right in. Mike wiped sweat from his forehead, making the final adjustments to the hand controls. His little auto shop sat on the edge of Harmony Creek, a quiet town where most folks were just trying to get by. At 38, Mike wasn't much different from the other mechanics in town, except for his deep respect for veterans. "Almost done, Mr. Miller," Mike called out, his voice echoing in the workshop. "Give it a try now." Frank wheeled himself closer to the '92 Chevy pickup. The truck wasn't much to look at, but it was his lifeline to getting around after losing the use of his legs years ago. Frank had adapted as best he could, but at 75, the homemade controls he'd been using just weren't cutting it anymore. "Listen here, I can pay you something," Frank insisted, his voice rough with pride. "Been putting money aside for months." Mike slid out from under the dashboard and stood up, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. "Not happening, sir. My grandpa served too. He always said the real heroes never ask for anything." Frank's eyes softened a bit, but his jaw remained set. "This ain't about recognition, it's about paying my bills." "Then consider this payment for what you and others gave for this country," Mike replied, testing the new handbrake. "Besides, I had these parts just collecting dust." That was a fib. Mike had driven to the next county over to find the specialized equipment and paid for it with his own money, money he could barely spare with the mortgage due next week. As the evening sun cast long shadows through the open garage door, Mike watched Frank test the controls. The old veteran's hands moved tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as he worked the brake and accelerator. A smile spread across his weathered face, the first genuine one Mike had seen since Frank had wheeled into his shop 3 days ago. "Freedom," Frank whispered, gripping the controls, his eyes shining with emotion. "That's what it is," Mike said, pretending not to notice the catch in the old man's voice. He busied himself with cleaning up tools, giving Frank a moment to compose himself. "You have no idea what this means," Frank finally said. "Doc says I probably shouldn't even be driving anymore, but without this truck." He didn't finish the sentence, he didn't need to. "Come back tomorrow," Mike said. "We'll take it for a test drive, make sure everything's working properly before you head home." Frank nodded, wheeling himself back from the truck. "I'll be here at 8 sharp." He paused, studying Mike with eyes that had seen a lot. "Don't think I don't know what you did here, son. And don't think I'll forget it." After Frank left, Mike stayed late into the night, double-checking every connection, every adjustment. The hand controls had to be perfect, Frank's safety depended on it. By the time he locked up, the moon was high overhead, and Mike was dead tired. The alarm blared at 6 a.m. Mike groaned, his back stiff from sleeping on the old couch in his office. He'd been too wiped out to drive home after finishing Frank's truck. He stumbled to the small bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and looked in the cracked mirror. Dark circles underlined his eyes, and a rough stubble darkened his jaw. He looked every bit as exhausted as he felt. "Coffee," he muttered, "I need coffee." The ancient pot in the corner of his office sputtered to life, filling the small space with the rich aroma of dark roast. Mike grabbed his mug and stepped outside to breathe in the crisp morning air. Harmony Creek was still asleep, the main street empty except for old Walter opening the hardware store and the occasional passing pickup. The peace was shattered by a sound Mike hadn't heard in years, a deep, rolling thunder that made every wrench in the shop rattle against the pegboard. The sound hit before he even stepped outside, vibrating through the concrete and up his legs. His head snapped up, coffee sloshing onto his hand as he scanned the sky. Then he saw it, a silver streak blazing over the treetops, sunlight dancing off the wings, a P-51 Mustang with a brilliant yellow nose cone and polished aluminum skin that caught the morning light like liquid metal. Its distinctive elliptical wings and unmistakable silhouette carved through the air with purpose, Not chance. The World War II fighter descended lower, staying clear of power lines as it approached his shop. Neighbors ran outside, shielding their eyes from the sun. Old Mr. Henderson from the hardware store stood frozen in the middle of the street, his morning newspaper forgotten at his feet. "What the heck?" Mike muttered as the plane screamed overhead, so low he could see the rivets in its wings. And wait. Were those numbers hand-painted in red? His fingers tightened around the coffee mug. Those markings looked familiar from a photo Frank had shown him, his old squadron from Korea. The mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the concrete. "For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." The Mustang banked hard with expert precision, the pilot's skill evident in every controlled movement. The engine's roar echoed off the surrounding hills as it circled back around. For a wild moment, Mike wondered if he was dreaming. P-51s were rare birds these days, mostly seen at air shows or museums, and they certainly didn't buzz small-town auto shops at daybreak. Bobby, Mike's part-time helper, burst out of the shop door, mouth hanging open. "Is that a Mustang? Like, a real one?" Mike didn't answer. He was watching the plane make one last deliberate pass, dipping its wings in what any pilot would recognize as a salute, before heading toward the Jenkins farm about a quarter-mile down the road. Old Mr. Jenkins had a grass airstrip he'd maintained since his crop dusting days. Most locals had forgotten it existed, but somebody clearly hadn't. The plane vanished from view. The shop was quiet now, just the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of car doors as townsfolk piled into vehicles to follow the excitement. And for the first time in a long time, Mike felt something like wonder in his chest. Someone had noticed. Someone remembered. Mike jumped in his pickup and drove quickly to the Jenkins property, gravel spitting from his tires. His heart was still pounding from the flyover, a mixture of adrenaline and something else he couldn't quite name. By the time he arrived, a small crowd had already begun to gather. The P-51 sat majestically on the grass strip, morning dew glistening on its wings. The Mustang was even more impressive up close, the sunlight catching every curve of its war-weathered frame. The distinctive red-painted tail numbers were now clearly visible. The engine ticked as it cooled, that distinctive sound of hot metal contracting. The canopy slid back with a mechanical precision that spoke of another era. A figure in a battered leather flight jacket and aviator sunglasses climbed out, dropping to the ground with practiced ease despite being well into his 60s. The pilot removed his helmet, revealing silver hair and a weathered face etched with laugh lines and history. Something in the set of his jaw, the confidence in his stance, reminded Mike of Frank. The pilot spotted him through the gathering onlookers and strode toward him with purpose. Mike stood rooted to the spot, still trying to process the reality of what was happening. The morning sun at the pilot's back cast him in a dramatic silhouette as he approached. "Are you Mike Johnson?" The pilot called out, his voice carrying the same no-nonsense tone as Frank's. Mike nodded, running a hand through his hair. "That's me. Mind telling me why you just buzzed my shop in a warbird?" The pilot grinned, the same stubborn grin Mike had seen on Frank's face when testing the hand controls, and extended his hand. "Colonel Frank Hargrove, retired. Frank Miller's son." Mike's jaw dropped as he shook the man's hand. "Your father?" He never mentioned that his son flies vintage aircraft. Frank laughed. "Dad's not one to brag. But he called me last night, told me what you did for him." His expression grew serious. "You have no idea what that means to him. To all of us." Mike shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't a big deal. Just hand controls. It was independence, dignity. Frank's voice was firm. "Things my father's been too proud to ask for, even from family." He looked back at the Mustang, its engine still ticking as it cooled. "I was at an air show 2 states over when he called. Got permission to make a slight detour on my way home." "So, you flew a World War II fighter plane to thank me?" Mike couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. "Technically, it's a Korean War veteran," Frank corrected with a smile. "Just like Dad." Old Smokey here flew combat missions in 51. Restored her myself. He patted Mike's shoulder. I wanted to thank you personally, and I thought you might appreciate the gesture. Before Mike could respond, a truck pulled into the Jenkins farm. Frank sat in the passenger seat, an older woman, presumably his wife, behind the wheel. When Frank spotted the P-51, his face lit up with a mixture of exasperation and pride. "You crazy old flyboy," Frank called out as his wife helped him into his wheelchair. "I told you a phone call would have been enough." Frank winked at Mike. Dad never could control his children. "Now, I believe you promised him a test drive of that truck." The morning unfolded like nothing Mike had ever experienced. Harmony Creek wasn't accustomed to events more exciting than the occasional fender bender, and a P-51 Mustang parked on the Jenkins farm drew a steady stream of onlookers. Children pressed their faces against the fence, and adults snapped photos with their phones while Frank took his newly modified Chevy for a test drive with Mike. Frank entertained the growing crowd with stories about the historic aircraft. By the time they returned "Works perfectly," Frank announced as he wheeled himself out of the truck, a grin splitting his face. "Turns out this young man knows what he's doing." "Never doubted it for a second," Colonel Hargrove replied, then lowered his voice. "Which is why I'd like to discuss a business proposition with him." After the test drive confirmed the controls were working perfectly, Colonel Hargrove pulled Mike aside. "My company restores vintage aircraft," he explained. "We're always looking for skilled mechanics who can think outside the box, someone who can adapt and improvise like you did with Dad's truck." Mike blinked. "I don't know the first thing about airplanes. You know machines. You know precision. The rest can be taught." Colonel Hargrove handed him a business card. "We've got a facility about 30 miles from here. Good pay, good benefits. Think about it." As they talked, Sheriff Brody's cruiser pulled up. The sheriff stepped out, adjusting his hat as he surveyed the scene. "Morning, Colonel," he said, nodding to Colonel Hargrove. "Got a call about a plane. Should have known it was you." Colonel Hargrove grinned. "All cleared with the FAA, Sheriff. Just a brief stop on my way home." The sheriff chuckled. "Move that plane before noon, or I'll have to start directing traffic." With that, he tipped his hat and drove off. While they talked, Mike noticed Frank sitting quietly in his wheelchair, watching his son with undisguised pride. Something about the old veteran's expression, the mixture of dignity and vulnerability, struck Mike deeply. His own grandfather had been a veteran, though he rarely spoke of his service. After a stroke left him partially paralyzed, he'd faced many of the same challenges Frank was facing now. But unlike Frank, his grandfather hadn't had anyone to adapt his car. The memory of the proud man reduced to depending on others for rides had inspired Mike to help veterans whenever he could. "For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." Frank wheeled himself over to Mike. "My son's always been one for grand gestures," he said, gesturing toward the P-51. "Gets it from his mother." Mike smiled. "It's not every day someone flies a vintage fighter to your shop. Made for an interesting morning." "He means well." Frank's weathered hands fidgeted with the wheels of his chair. "Did he offer you a job?" "How did you know?" "Because I asked him to." Frank looked up, meeting Mike's eyes. "Not as charity, because you've got the kind of skills his company needs." Frank's wife approached, her eyes warm with gratitude. "I'm Helen," she said, offering her hand. Frank's wife. She squeezed Mike's hand gently. "You gave him back his freedom." "Thank you." A news van pulled into the Jenkins farm, but Mike ducked away, uncomfortable with the attention. He'd never sought recognition for helping Frank, it was simply the right thing to do. Inside Jenkins' old barn, Frank followed Mike, leaving the reporters to interview Colonel Hargrove instead. "Sorry about all this," Frank said. "Frank tends to go overboard." Mike shook his head. "It's not that. I'm not used to people making a fuss over me doing my job." "Is that all you think this was, your job?" Frank's eyes were piercing. You could have charged me full price for those controls. Could have installed something basic instead of spending all night getting it perfect. Could have treated me like just another customer instead of a man trying to hold on to his dignity. Mike didn't know how to respond. He'd always tried to treat people right, especially veterans like Frank. He'd seen too many come home forgotten, their sacrifices unacknowledged. My son told me about his offer, Frank continued. It's a good opportunity, but you're worried about your shop. He gestured toward the window where Mike's auto repair sign was visible in the distance. Mike nodded. My dad built that shop from nothing. Worked himself into an early grave keeping it going. I always figured I'd pass it on someday. To who? Frank asked gently. The question hit Mike like a punch to the gut. There was no one, no wife, no children, just him working 12-hour days in a shop that barely broke even in a town that was slowly dying. I don't know, he admitted. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. Frank found this when he was looking you up last night. Thought you might want to see it. Mike took the yellowed paper carefully. It was an article from the Harmony Creek Gazette dated 15 years earlier. His father stood proudly in front of the newly opened auto shop, arm around a teenage Mike's shoulders. The headline read, Local mechanic opens shop to help veterans. Your dad started this place with a mission, Frank said quietly. Frank did some digging, found out your father offered discounts to every veteran who came through that door, even when the shop was struggling. Mike stared at the clipping, memories flooding back, his father staying late to fix Mrs. Wilson's car after her husband was deployed, charging old Mr. Peterson half price for a new transmission because he'd served in Vietnam. Small kindnesses that Mike had continued without really thinking about why. I never knew that was why he opened the shop. Legacies aren't always about places, Mike, Frank said, tapping the clipping. Sometimes they're about purpose. Outside, Colonel Hargrove was preparing for takeoff, answering a few final questions from the small crowd. The P-51 gleamed in the morning sun, an incongruous sight next to the faded barn of the Jenkins farm. Frank's company restores warbirds, Frank continued, preserves the history of men and women who served. Different machines, same mission as your dad's. Mike carefully refolded the clipping. I need some time to think about it. Frank nodded. Of course. But maybe start by talking to young Robbie out there. Robbie Jenkins? Mike asked, surprised. Robbie was the 17-year-old grandson of the farm owner who sometimes helped around Mike's shop after school. Good with engines, better with computers. Kid's been watching you work on my truck all week, Frank said. Told me he wishes he could learn to do what you do. Maybe there's your legacy, training the next generation. Before Mike could respond, Colonel Hargrove walked in. Sorry to interrupt, but I need to get Old Smokey back in the air soon. My neck's not getting any younger. He looked at Mike. Thought you might want to see her up close before I go. The next 20 minutes flew by as Colonel Hargrove gave Mike a detailed tour of the P-51, explaining the restoration process, the challenges of finding original parts, the precision required to keep a 7-decade-old fighter airworthy. Mike found himself asking technical questions, his mechanic's mind fascinated by the solutions Colonel Hargrove's team had developed. You'd fit right in, Colonel Hargrove said as they completed the tour. My engineers would love your perspective on the hydraulic systems. As Colonel Hargrove prepared for takeoff, Frank handed Mike an envelope. What's this? Mike asked. Payment, Frank said firmly. Not negotiable. Mike started to protest, but Frank cut him off. It's not for the parts or labor. It's an investment in my son's company, a small one, but it comes with a condition, that they hire you at fair market value. His eyes twinkled. I may be old, but I still know how to negotiate. The small crowd moved back as Colonel Hargrove started the Mustang's engine. The mighty Merlin roared to life, vibrating the air around them. Colonel Hargrove gave a thumbs up from the cockpit, the canopy still open. Think about it. He shouted over the engine noise. We'll hold the position for 2 weeks. As the P-51 taxied down the grass strip, Mike felt a tug on his sleeve. It was Robbie Jenkins, his eyes wide with excitement. "Mr. Johnson, that was really a P-51 Mustang!" he exclaimed, nearly bouncing with enthusiasm. "Sure was," Mike replied. "Pretty amazing, huh? The coolest thing ever." Robbie's gaze followed the aircraft as it accelerated down the strip, lifting gracefully into the sky. "How'd you get a World War II fighter to land at our farm?" Mike watched the Mustang climb, sunlight glinting off its polished skin. "By doing a job right," he said simply. "And respecting the people who fought for us." Robbie nodded seriously. "Like Mr. Miller. My grandpa was in Vietnam. Says nobody ever fixed his truck like you fixed it last year." Mike looked at the boy, really looked at him, saw the intelligence in his eyes, the genuine interest in machines. "How'd you like to learn more about cars, like Mr. Miller's specialized modifications?" Robbie's face lit up. "You mean it? You'd teach me that stuff?" "Maybe." Mike glanced at Frank, who was watching them with a knowing smile. "I might need someone to help run things if I take on some new challenges." As the small crowd dispersed and the Mustang became a distant speck in the sky, Mike felt something he hadn't experienced in years: possibility. The weight of obligation that had kept him tied to a struggling business began to feel less like a burden and more like a foundation to build upon. 2 weeks later, Mike stood in the hangar of Hargrove Restoration, surrounded by vintage aircraft in various stages of repair. Colonel Hargrove led him through the facility, introducing him to a team of mechanics and engineers who shared a common purpose: preserving history while honoring those who had served. Back in Harmony Creek, Robbie Jenkins was opening Mike's auto repair for the day, the veteran's discount sign freshly painted and prominently displayed. Mike would still spend weekends at the shop, teaching Robbie and handling the specialized adaptations for disabled clients, but Monday through Friday, his hands would learn new machines, his mind would tackle new challenges. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. As Mike ran his hand along the aluminum skins of a partially restored B-25 bomber, he thought about the chain of events that had brought him here: 1 act of kindness to a proud old veteran, 1 recognition that doing the right thing wasn't just good business, it was good living. "Ready to get started?" Colonel Hargrove asked, holding out a set of specialized tools. Mike took them, feeling their weight in his hands: tools to build, to restore, to make whole again, not so different from what he'd been doing all along. "Yes, sir," he replied, a sense of purpose filling him. "I'm ready." Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the smallest acts of decency. For Mike Johnson, it had started with adapting hand controls for a veteran too proud to ask for help. It had continued with a P-51 Mustang buzzing his shop, bringing with it not just attention but opportunity. And now, surrounded by the machines that had carried brave men and women into battle, Mike had found a new purpose: creating freedom for those who had fought for his. After all, that's what mechanics do: they fix things, they make them work again, and sometimes, if they're very lucky, they find themselves fixed in return. Love this story? Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Don't forget to check out the video currently on your screen, you won't want to miss it. See you in the next one.